There are moments that make the night tilt. Small, fierce acts that rearrange the furniture of a heart. A dead street lamp could be the world until a single doorstep light becomes a sun. On the night he thought all light had left him, something small and stubborn began to pull itself along the cold stones toward that thin, honest lamp. It was not a spectacle. It was a summons. The sound was a scraping sigh, the shape a practice in persistence. A slow, deliberate hauling, a patient arithmetic of inches. Those who saw it later would argue over causes and timing. For him, watching from his window with the lens he had learned to trust, it was a plea written in breath. He had been a man who measured days in empty teacups and folded newspapers. A man whose silence had grown like moss in the corners. What moved toward his lit threshold was an answer to a question he had not remembered asking. The camera, warm as an honest animal in his hands, found what his ears could not refuse. This is the hour the ordinary cracked open and something living crawled through the seam and asked softly. He lived in a house that remembered him by habit more than by name. The front door had learned to open in a way that made no ceremony of a man coming home alone. The clock on the mantel spoke the time as if to keep him company, and rarely expected an answer. He had once kept his life in bright places. A certain tilt of a head that belonged to a beloved wife, the clink of teaspoons that meant 2 cups of tea, the small, generous clamor of shared routines. Those days had gone into the soil of the house like seeds that do not sprout. What remained were their echoes. A cup with an old lipstick stain hidden in the sink, a single slipper abandoned by the armchair, a scarf folded over the back of a chair that still smelled faintly of lavender on the warm days. Grief had not been a storm that passed. It was a slow weathering, a careful erosion of light. He was a man who kept tools for keeping things. A camera on the sill of his highest window, a notepad with pencil nicks along the edge, a pair of gloves that had once been useful for hands that worked in the garden. He had grown small routines to sit inside, each one polite and neat, as if habit could be a lock against the world's capacity to surprise him. His neighbors thought him quiet. The postman thought him precise. Children on the street thought, because old people in houses sometimes do, that he belonged to the past. He did not belong to anything now but his memory and the little house's careful catacombs of habit. The camera had started as a means to capture light, and then had become a habit like prayer. He trained the lens on the ordinary because his ordinary had been all the wonder left. He filmed street birds in the mornings, the way light cut the pavement at noon, the small comet of a paper bag that rolled and then stopped under the influence of a particular wind. Photography taught him to look for negotiation between shadow and brightness, the way a life arranges itself into recognitions. The glass at the end of the barrel became an ally. It would accept and record and never refute. He had learned to listen to it, and in listening it taught him to expect that the world would one day answer. On the table beneath the window sat a pot with a plant that refused to die. It was an obstinate little thing, a sprig of rosemary that had survived years of being half loved and half forgotten. The herb would sprout new shoots in spring, thin and eager as whispers, and in winter it would turn a brittle, patient gray and then surprise him by recovering. He liked the rosemary the way one likes a living sentence. It was an example that life could keep renewing itself even when the household meant otherwise. There was also an ivy, whose tendrils ran like inquiries along the windowsill, and a faded geranium in a cracked pot that still held its scent like a confession. These plants kept a small chapter of hope in the room, and often he found himself talking to them as if to companions, not words the world could hear, but small offerings offered in the hush between one breath and the next. His ordinary day had a timetable of quietness. He rose at dawn because the house never learned to allow him the indulgence of waking late. He brewed tea whose aroma filled the kitchen with memories he could trust, and then he sat by the window and watched the street come to order. He watched children in their uniforms march toward the school like a parade of small weather, watched the grocer sweep, watched light being made and unmade on the pavement in 1-hour ceremonies. He would sometimes set the camera to record the street for an hour, more for the discipline than for any expectation of drama. The camera took things in with the patient indifference of something that loved secrets but did not demand answers. People in his life had thinned. Where there had been conversation, there was now a slow audit of silence, a catalog of what remained. He was a man who walked through his own rooms and discovered the past like a collection of artifacts. each silver spoon, each teacup an oracle. He had ways of measuring his sorrow, in the number of chairs at the table, in the tilt of light on certain days. He had learned how grief rearranges small things until the shape of life is altered. He had also learned a certain humility before the world, that sometimes all the making of sense in a day would amount to little more than noticing the way a pigeon drank from a puddle. Neighbors did not come by often. There were polite letters left at his door from distant nieces, and there were the visits of a neighbor who brought a casserole in winter and spoke at a distance that suggested love without conferring on him the duty of returning it. There were also children who peered at him when he sat by his window like a small ritual lion. The house accepted these rare encounters gratefully and then folded them away. He had no family who lived nearby. His life had become the narrow, good frame of routine and the wide, quiet interior of a room that knew how to keep time. Then, in the dull margin of an otherwise ordinary night, the house's small palindrome of habits was interrupted. It began with a sound that did not belong to their accustomed vocabulary, a scrape that was smaller than a footstep and more like a manuscript being read aloud in careful letters. The noise came from the path that ran past the hedge and along to the stoop, a sound of rubbing against stone and of something that took the world as if it were a sentence to be completed. The man heard it because he could not help but listen. His hearing had learned to gather small events like lost coins. He looked out of the window, and the camera, which always lived on its tripod with one eye to the street, was already cupping the light. At first, it would have been easy to imagine it was a branch or the neighbor's old wheelbarrow, but the motion had a deliberate honesty. It was a movement as if someone or something were stating a long, slow truth, 1 inch, then another, then another. There was a muted persistence to it, the kind of persistence that belongs to animals, to the sea, and to the patient turning of seasons. He watched the recorded frame and saw a little mound of intent on the walkway, something that had chosen the direction of his lit doorstep and refused to be deterred. The cat arrived as behavior before it arrived as a being. At the first glance, the camera registered not a coat and eyes, but a manner, a pattern of patience, a decision to proceed in spite of pain. It did not leap or dart. It did not demand. It dragged itself with the economy of someone who has been schooled in small economies of energy. The man watched the footage in the hush of his sitting room, the rosemary scent threading the scene like punctuation, and realized that he was watching a life turn itself into a pilgrim. The motion was so slow the night could have read it as a lullaby. Its slowness made it an insistence. He had never been much of an animal person, though he had loved creatures in the abstract the way people love poems. Yet watching this thing approach the light, a lamp that burned with the domestic stubbornness of a porch bulb set to befriend the dark, he felt a flinch of responsibility. The cat's head would lift at intervals as if to check distance, then settle again. It would pause and then haul itself forward with a kind of arithmetic that broke the heart. There were small details that the camera insisted upon. A paw that tried to clutch the air and then settled. A breathing that mapped itself in the shallow rise of a shoulder. The house, which had been an archive of solitude, became a witness. He set the camera to record and, as if by primitive contract, he fetched the old quilt from the spare room. He moved more quickly than his body liked. The grief in him had fossilized his movements into a polite slowness. Yet something in the sight of the animal's ceaseless approach made him young with urgency. He wrapped the quilt about his arms the way one wraps a promise. The rosemary on the sill watched with the green patience of a faithful spectator. Its leaves did not speak, but the man felt them as if they were an audience of quiet affirmations. It was not yet dawn. The streetlights hummed the same small song they had hummed for years, and the neighbor's cat, a plump, indifferent beast that had once allowed itself the arrogance of the entire block, slept as if the world owed it nothing. The scent of the kitchen had gone stale. He opened the door and let the lamplight spill across the porch as if dispensing a small honest mercy. The cool air touched his face. For the first time in many days, the house did not feel like the only place he could be. There was an immediate small reckoning at the threshold. The cat had made itself to the step and then paused as if reading the light. It looked up and measured the man in the doorway with a gaze that was all modest business. It was not a gaze that demanded pity, only acknowledgement. Its eyes were careful, its body an edited poem of restraint. Already, the scene bore the weight of unasked questions. Where had it come from? How long had it been at the mercy of streets? Who had taught it such a brave patience? The man reached down without thinking. His hands were older than they felt, and they trembled like small flags. He lifted the creature by its middle as one might lift a fragile book from a shelf, and the cat folded into him the way a practiced listener folds into a story. The room allowed itself no grand epiphanies. It absorbed the animal as if it were a new sentence added to an old paragraph. He carried the cat inside, and the rosemary's aroma bent toward them as if to bless the passage. The cat's breathing was thin, and each breath made the quietness into an instrument. It lay on the quilt in a posture of someone who had given up the pretense of posture and accepted what remained, an honest, exhausted surrender. The man found himself watching the chest, counting breaths as if they were the last of that species of music he had learned to keep time with. There were clues in the cat's behavior that spoke more loudly than any description could. It sought the warmth of the light with the instinct of a creature that had learned that heat could be refuge. It pushed itself toward the lamp's lingering halo and, at times, tried to rake itself forward with a paw as if to embrace that brightness. When he lifted his hand, it pawed back once and then lay still, as if it had used all the strength it had on the approach. Its mouth opened occasionally for a mewl that was more a punctuation than a sentence, a soft single note that said, "I am here." He set it down by the kitchen table and fetched a saucer of warm milk from a cupboard. The cat drank with a solemn hunger that suggested it had been denied small mercies for too long. It lapped as if drinking could be the remedy to everything, and in that quiet consumption the man felt something begin to uncoil within him. It was not yet a healing, but it was recognition that someone else's need could lift him from the flat ledger of his own sorrow and return him to the work of responding. Outside, the night hummed. Indoors, the lamp made a small island where the man and the cat kept each other company. He arranged cushions to form a nest and propped a light that was not the glaring business of renovation, but the honest yellow of a bedside lamp. He placed the camera on the table and set it to record, not because he believed the footage would become a spectacle, but because some part of him needed the camera's faith. Glass is a witness that will tell the truth without accusation. He realized then that he had been waiting for a story to inhabit the house again, some small narrative that could undo the heavy grammar of his loneliness. As he sat, the rosemary's leaves brushed the tabletop like a tiny benediction. The ivy traced a speculative line along the window frame, and the geranium, though resting in a pot with a crack, held its color as if color itself could be courage. These plants, simple as they were, had been the small proofs that life could assert itself in stubborn ways. They now watched the scene, and a man and an exhausted animal, with the impartiality of quiet friends. The man felt their presence like a chorus behind the main singers. He felt that the house itself had leaned forward to witness a small miracle. He would later call the arrival an inciting incident, because the world likes tidy phrases for things that alter its course. But in that first hour it was more than a plot point. It was a breach of the particular loneliness that had enclosed him. The cat's deliberate pilgrimage toward the light had tugged at something dormant in him. He found himself arranging blankets, speaking to the animal in tones he had not used in years, and thinking in fragments of sentences the way he had when life still felt like a long conversation. The camera, steady and patient, kept the record of the hour as if to say, "This happened. This was true." Outside, a street lamp flickered in sympathy. Inside, the man smoothed the quilt and placed the cat within the circle of light. He did not know if it would live through the night. He did not know whether he could bear to have it die in his home. He only knew that it had come to his doorstep carrying a story written in the language of endurance, and that the language demanded an answer. The rosemary's small green leaves raised their faces as if to greet a guest returned. He closed the window against the draft and sat beside the cat, watching the slow, fragile science of breath. This is where the ordinary world negotiated with the extraordinary. A man who had taught himself to be alone, and a creature who had taught itself to be brave enough to seek light. The inciting thread had been pulled. The house had admitted it, and the path of what must come next was set in motion. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The days that followed the cat's thin arrival unspooled with a strange, reluctant tenderness, as if the house itself were learning to breathe again. He moved among his rooms like a man reconciling with an old map, tentative at first, then with a steadier hand. The quilt that had formed the cat's first bed wore the scent of warm milk and a faint trace of the street. He laid newspapers along the floor to catch what the cat might leave behind. The act felt less like housekeeping and more like a ritual of care. Each small duty, filling the saucer, ministering a wet cloth to a soiled ear, counting the breathing, stitched him to something larger than his grief. He found within himself a quiet astonishment that a being so fragile could demand such careful attention, and that answering such a demand could return him to the practice of living. Yet the practicalities of living with another life soon pressed against the gentleness of the first hour. The animal's labored breathing did not simply ease with warmth. The vet's clinic near the market had the efficient kindness of people who met suffering often. The veterinarian spoke in the cool, precise language of a trade that tends to fragile bodies. She named possibilities: infection, internal injury, time without nourishment. In short sentences, she offered tests and an operation that would help and a price that would bruise. Not so much in money alone, but because the proposal required action he had not taken in years. Asking someone else to intervene, accepting help, putting a small life in the hands of strangers. He had no children to call for counsel, no family account into which he could dip. What he had were an old watch he had not worn in years, and a small savings that had been gathered for quieter ends. The choice set itself like a plain riddle: pay and risk his frugality, deny and risk the cat. It was an arithmetic of care, a ledger that made kindness transactional and him miserly in the currency of compassion. The cat, for her part, gave no counsel. She would look at him with the measured gravity of one who has chosen trust once and will not retract it. When he lifted her to the carrier for the first time, she made a dry sound that could be read as a permission and as a plea. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and old newspapers. The lights hummed with the business of saving lives. The veterinarian's hands were sure and quiet. She made him wait while she washed, while she measured, while she explained. He watched the clock hands parade in tiny, indifferent ritual and felt, with a peculiar clarity, how long human kindness could be stretched. He found ways to find money. He sold a pocket watch he had kept for decades, one with a face that had long ago lost its shine. It paid for the first round of care. He bartered small services for a neighbor's promise of loan. He pawned some plates whose pattern had belonged to other hands. Each transaction felt like a confession and a gift. The community, when roused, was a soft, surprising thing. The woman who delivered casseroles in winter arranged a small evening with neighbors and friends, who pooled spare coins like a collection of whispered prayers. It was curious to discover how quickly strangers could become kin when a life was at stake. The act of assembling the funds made him aware that, though he had lived alone, he had not been entirely abandoned. While the vet worked, he watched the camera footage again and again in the quiet of his sitting room, like a man reading a line of scripture for meaning. The footage, which he had originally thought of as nothing more than a record of a curious event, now read like evidence. It revealed patterns he had not perceived in the half-asleep rush of his first alarms. The cat's arrival had not been a single dramatic entry, but the end note of a longer movement. Nights prior, the camera had captured the animal's presence on the edges of the frame, a silhouette that paused beneath a window, an urgent stillness in the gutter, a slow progression inch by inch. On one clip, the cat had been younger, sprightlier. On another, more recent, she dragged herself in fits of exhaustion. In those small frames, there was a life that had been rehearsing its advance, but hidden among those frames there were other presences, not animals, but the shadow of a human shape. At first the figure was tentative, an outline coasting at the margins like a thought. Then, on replaying a night he had missed, the shape became clearer. A person in a hood lingered near the alley where padlocked trash bins kept their silent trash rituals. The figure watched as the cat approached. At the moment the animal clutched the stone and hauled itself toward the lamplight, the figure stepped away into shadow. In another frame, the figure crouched at the corner and made a motion that could be read as a tossing, a pushing, a gesture of threat. The man rewound the pixels until his eyes watered. He wanted to be charitable. The mind is merciful when unsure. Perhaps the figure had been a passerby, indifferent. Perhaps it had helped the cat and left. Yet there was something about the angle, the way the shadow's shoulders inclined, the half-seen movement of an arm, that read more like a record of violence than of charity. The footage had always been the camera's simple, pitiless truth. Now it dealt him a charge and left him to weigh it. When he showed the clips to the veterinarian during a pause between treatments, she frowned, not with the clinical detachment he had expected, but with an expression that carried the weight of moral arithmetic. "There are cruel people," she said, the words flat and unadorned. "And there are nights when animals must face them." Her voice suggested a long history of seeing similar shadows in other footage. A dog flung from a car, a cat abandoned in a park. The footage seemed to confirm what his hands had feared, that this arrival had not been a tale of a wandering creature finding kindness, but a story of endurance under pressure. The idea sat in his stomach like a stone. From that knowledge grew a new unrest. He felt anger, not the quick, bright anger of sudden offenses, but a slow, righteous fury that made his bones ache. Who had been the one to cast this small life into the street? Who had watched and not helped? And if someone had been cruel, what else would that someone be capable of? He began to look at the shadows under the hedges and the faces of passers-by, with a suspicion he had not possessed before. Where once he had been content to let the world proceed with its own indifference, he now found himself looking for pattern and intent. His solitude, which had been a place of retreat, became a vantage point from which to observe the passage of other lives. He put a notice up in the grocer's window and another at the bus stop. Found, small female cat, wounded, found at Doorstep light. The hand-lettered sign felt absurdly vulnerable and yet necessary, an admission that he needed the world's help and that perhaps the world could answer. He left a saucer and towel on his doorstep with the sign, an act that felt like leaving breadcrumbs for a conscience. Neighbors came by, some with caution in their eyes, others with the blunt kindness of people unafraid of emotion. The postal boy who had watched the footage on the man's camera when the man had shown him in a moment of nervous camaraderie began to ask discreet questions about the alleys. Children in the street offered theories. Perhaps the cat had belonged to a faraway house. Perhaps she had simply grown tired. A woman named Farah, who lived 3 houses down and had an indulgent manner with all creatures, brought soft blankets and a small tin of sardines, the kind of thing strays found uncontestedly delicious. Her presence was like a warm wind, practical and unshowy, yet not all responses were gentle. One neighbor, a man who kept his own yard immaculately and disliked what he called street refuse, looked upon the cat and the man with a thin, narrowed eye. "We ought to call animal control," he suggested in a voice that assumed authority. "Let them take it away. We don't want vermin around the stoops." The man felt his skin prickle. The neighbor's remark was a reminder that care is not the only currency in a tight world. There are always those who prefer order to kindness and who confuse the two. The neighbor's suggestion made clear an ugly possibility, that a call to a state body could separate him from this fragile life before a court of veterinary necessity could be convened. The prospect tightened his chest. Amid these social tensions, there were smaller calamities to navigate. The cat's appetite was inconsistent, her energy dragging at times like wet cloth, and then at others, a small flare of curiosity would lead her to bat at the yarn on the man's sleeve. She would close one eye to sunlight and for a brief instant look like a small green ember in the blanket of the room. She avoided the doorway when a certain dog barked outside, and she shied at the sound of heels on the pavement. Her wounds scabbed and bled in ways that made the man both tender and fearful. He learned the rhythm of her sleep, light because of pain and heavy with the exhaustion of recovery. Each morning he counted breaths as if they were beads on a string, and each evening he thanked the rosemary when it seemed to stand a little more eager in its pot, as if sharing in the small miracle. He also discovered a small brass tag under the cat's fur at the nape of her neck, hidden by the thinning ruff. It bore an inscription faint with use, a name, Mina, and beneath it a sequence of digits scrawled by a small, worn hand, 3 numbers and then a scratched space, half of the number rubbed away as if by repeated loving fingers. The tag felt like a clue handed to him by a reluctant past. Mina, a name in his voice, was an offering. He set about trying to piece the number together by logic and by asking neighbors. Was Mina a pet? The tag suggested so, yet no neighbor claimed her. The scratches on the tag were not the neat marks of a factory, but the uneven strokes of a human who had once needed to remember this small life's tether. That evening, as dusk spread violet across the yard, he decided on a plan that combined stubbornness and longing. He would comb the routes the camera had recorded, the alleys, the stoops, the small gardens where stray food could invite an animal into the theater of human residences. He took the camera with him. For the first time since the cat's arrival, he would be the one to walk the route and not merely watch from a flat window. The rosemary and the geranium watched him out the glass like two small augurs whose leaves had learned to speak in green gestures. The night smelled of turned earth and the savory tang of late-season winds. Walking the route felt like moving through a map of possible regrets. He stopped where the cat had been last seen on the pavement and pressed his palm to a stone that still held the warmth of day. He looked into the dark corners where the city keeps its secrets. Beneath a discarded sofa on a back alley, behind a fence where old newspapers gathered like a small made-up beach. He called the name Mina in a low, careful tone that did not pretend to command. The night folded his voice and returned it with a softness that was not hostile. A small fox of sound replied from the concrete. A rustle, a suspicion of cat movement, and then nothing. On the third turn of his walk, he came upon a scrap of cloth snagged on a nail, a strip of faded fabric that, on the camera playback at home, had appeared momentarily between the cat and the hooded figure. The cloth was ordinary, the sort of thing that littered the edges of daily life, a remnant of a bag, a rag. Yet in the context of his investigations, it read as an artifact. He slid the scrap into his pocket like a relic of some minor archaeology. He would later find, when he set the camera to magnify the footage, that the cloth carried a mark, a small stamped emblem of a local delivery company, a courier that had a reputation for hiring casual hands and leaving jobs unpaid. That detail smelled less of providence and more of particularity. The figure in the hood may have been a courier or a drifter wearing such garments. It was a thread he could follow. By the time he returned home, the man had reasoned himself into a plan of two parts. Find Mina's owner, if any, and if none revealed itself, become Mina's champion. The decision changed the geometry of his days. He slept in tasks and wakes in appointments, a man made busier by another life than by his own. He kept the camera on a continuous cycle and left it recording, like an extended prayer. He made small flyers with the name Mina and the partial number and stuck them to telephone poles. He moved through the neighborhood with the slow clarity of someone accustomed to doing one thing at a time, but now practicing the careful multiplication of acts of care. Midway through this ascent toward commitment, he paused and asked the question that the quiet allowed. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest? He posted the questions, not as a plea, but as a soft invitation in conversation, and he watched faces respond with small confessions. A woman from the corner bakery told him of a cat who waited on her stoop for months until she finally took it in. A young man who fixed bicycles said he had an old hound that sat outside his door like an adoring guardian, until the man's heart healed from a bad love. The stories that arrived like small letters restored something to his chest. That attachment could be mutual, that waiting could be a form of prophecy. The act of asking made him less alone because it invited others to bring their remembrances, their tender witness. The community stories were consolation and also a mirror. They revealed a pattern of human and animal lives interfused, and they hinted at the darker truth that some lives are tenderly kept, while others are thrown away. One story, told in a breathy whisper, altered the tenor of his quest. The grocer's daughter told him, with a look that held something like shame, that a certain youth on the edge of the neighborhood kept a habit of cruelty. He described a lanky boy with a motorcycle jacket who liked to see what animals would do when prodded. A petty tormentor who mistook power for sport. The man's hands tightened around the note he had been given, and the trajectory of his worry bowed into a sharper shape. Here was a lead that was less abstract and more hard-edged. A person who might be the figure in the footage. The idea was no longer only a moral problem. It was a question of accountability. He sought the boy, not with muscle but with questions. He spoke to the vendor who ran the sweet shop and to the bus driver who liked to gossip. A common name popped up, Arif. Arif, they said, had been seen near the alley on nights when small things went missing. He's a troublemaker, said the bus driver with an airy, world-weary shrug. But you don't go poking trouble into trouble. It multiplies. The man felt beneath the caution a hesitation that was not cowardice but the sober recognition of risks. Confrontation could provoke violence. Yet to leave such acts uninvestigated was to affirm them. The turning point pressed itself into him like a living thing. He could call the police and lodge a complaint, though the act of doing so might send the boy into shadowy avoidance and solve nothing. He could take Mina and disappear from the neighborhood with her, carry her to a new life in solitude. A stealthy rescue that would spare him the pain of social conflict, but would deny justice to a harmed creature. Or he could stand in the street and ask questions until someone answered. Each option bore a cost. He chose a third way. He would gather evidence and appeal to the community's conscience. He would show the footage at the grocer's counter, on a small screen held aloft like a town crier's whip. He would press the fact of the footage into people's hands, the visible, pixelated proof of a cruelty that might otherwise be dismissed as rumor. He organized a small showing in the grocer's back room and invited the neighbors who had been kind. In the dim light of that cramped space, the footage flickered across a screen and the room's faces were drawn inward. He watched for the reaction and found in those eyes a small quake. The muzzle of collective shame rose like heat when wrongs were exposed. Several faces turned stern. One of them, the neighbor who had earlier suggested animal control, took a long look and, to the man's surprise, muttered, "That boy should be stopped." His rigid posture softened into a soldier's stance. Collectively, they agreed to confront the matter not with mob justice, but with a delegation to speak to the boy's parents and to ask the landlord to intervene. The grocer, who had once been a local magistrate, offered to mediate. It seemed for a time as if community and duty had been stitched together with a practical stitch. They found the boy, Arif, in the company of other youths under an old flyover where the light broke into its own patterns. He was younger than the man had pictured, with a nervous energy and a jacket that carried the smell of petrol. When the man confronted him with the footage, not in a performative rage but with the steady insistence of someone who had seen a truth, Arif's face folded like paper. "It was only for fun," he said, the phrase a flimsy shield. "We didn't mean for it to get like this." The boy's father, when called, took his son by the shoulder with a mix of shame and denial. Apologies were issued. The man listened to the small litany of excuses and felt bewilderingly both relief and doubt. Yet the situation refused to resolve into clean lines. Arif's apology mattered less to Mina's fragile chest than the immediate need of care. The vet's bills were mounting, and the animal's condition teetered. He had tried to hold the community's process and the cat's urgent care in the same hand, and the strain showed. Then came another detail that the footage revealed with merciless clarity. In one frame, as the cat stopped to rest beneath the porch, the light around her seemed to flare and then to dim, and a second, smaller motion in the periphery suggested that someone had picked something up, a small shape, and carried it back into shadow. On the playback, the light caught a flash that could be a small child's shoe, and the timestamp on the frame placed the motion at 3 a.m. The evidence suggested not only cruelty but also that others, perhaps younger, had been involved or present. It was this discovery that turned the air thin. The man realized that the story was more complicated. It involved not only a single petty tormentor, but a net of young people and perhaps even adults who had normalized such behavior. He felt the particular ache of responsibility sharpen. Justice, he knew now, would not be a single act but a slow correction. He doubled his efforts. He took Mina back to the vet for further attention. He pressed the grocer and the landlord to move on the complaint, and he stayed up nights reviewing footage, counting pixels like grains of truth. On one such night, when the lamp at his door offered the only honest light, the man watched a clip that froze him as if a hand had closed about his heart. In the footage, Mina, smaller and less worn, paused by a drain and looked up as if she heard a voice. For the briefest beat, her ears pricked, and in the hush of the frame there appeared at the edge a figure holding something slender and pale, a child, perhaps, or a slender adult hand cradling a small soft toy. The motion was tender and then gone, as if someone had decided that pity was too dangerous. The man pressed pause until the image pixelated into the soft grief of stillness. He could not tell if the hand meant to harm or to comfort. It was the ambiguity that troubled him. The footage offered both accusation and a mirror to his own need to know. That night, returning from the clinic in a car that made her feel like a precious parcel, he found the door front lit and the quilt sat in its place. Mina slept in a posture that suggested she had fallen into an exhausted small trust. He knelt and laid his forehead close to her and felt the minute beat of life. It was a small miracle, and he carried it into the next day like a hidden treasure. Yet as he rose from watching the animal breathe, there came a knock at the door. One single measured rap that echoed like a metronome. He opened to find no neighbor and no kindly volunteer. The street was empty. On the porch lay a scrap of paper folded in careful thirds. He picked it up, fingers unsteady, and unfolded it. On the paper was a short line written in small, hurried script we saw do not tell. The words had the blunt, trembling threat of someone who had decided to speak in cipher. Beneath the sentence, a phone number had been scratched, half of its digits smudged as if someone had tried to make it illegible. The man's thumb felt the raised impression of the ink and then the dry, thin smear where digits had been rubbed away. The scrap bore no signature. It smelled faintly of petrol and wet concrete. In the immediate second that followed the discovery, he felt a chill like a current. Someone close to the events had left him a message, neither help nor warning, but a demand that he be quiet. His next move would be the one that altered the course of his nights. He had to decide whether to call the number, to force the unknown into a conversation, or to heed the demand to silence. The choice was no longer simply about a wounded animal. It had grown into a question of risk and courage, of whether a man could withstand the pressure of speaking truth when silence seemed easier. He stood with the scrap of paper and the cat's faint breaths beside him, and in the room the rosemary's leaves shivered like a congregation waiting for the sermon. He lifted the phone and, with a pulse that suddenly felt too large for his chest, began to dial the partial number on the tag, trying to persuade the missing digits into place by memory and by a reckless, hopeful guess. The first ring sounded like a bell in the cramped room. The second pulled taut his nerves. On the third ring a voice answered, thin and immediate, and not a child's, but something older, edged with a warning that made his skin prick. "Who is this?" the voice asked. He opened his mouth intending to speak of Mina and of footage and of the messy arithmetic of kindness. Instead, a shadow of sound came from the line, a scrape, the inhale of someone thinking fast. Then the voice returned like a shutter falling. "Don't call that number again. If you value yourself, don't call. Keep the animal and keep quiet." The line went dead. The man stood with the handset like a talisman. Outside, a distant dog barked. Inside, Mina shifted and made a soft sound as if to remind him of the breath of what mattered. He had expectations of the world that had been humble and gentle. Now they were crossed with a threat that tasted metallic in his mouth. He had always believed that small acts of kindness would be rewarded by their own quietness. Instead, he had been told to hide the kindness away, to tuck it under the floorboards. The instruction landed like an invitation to cowardice. He might have closed the matter there and folded away his film. He might have kept Mina in the small, safe orbit of their room and never again risked the community's partial justice. But something in him, a thread that had been stitched in the house's old light and the rosemary's stubborn green, did not allow for such retreat. The camera, the small recordings, the faces of neighbors who had softened at the footage all made a chorus that urged him forward. Some wrongs require the discomfort of exposure. He decided with the slow, decisive breath of a man who steps into the rain that he would no longer act only as a keeper of small, private mercies. He would seek the truth outward, and in doing so risk the breath he had learned to hold so carefully. He placed the scrap of paper in his coat pocket and turned back to the cat's thin chest. Mina moved her head and blinked at him with the limpid wisdom of animals, and in that glance there lay both plea and blessing. He had lit the lamplight for her, and that light had been a beacon. But light cast shadows as well as warmth. There were corners in which things wanted to stay hidden. Outside the window, the street seemed to hold its breath too, as if preparing for some small, inevitable reckoning. He did not know then what the next hour would bring. He only knew that the stakes had climbed from a matter of medicine to a problem that required courage. He would call the number again. He would gather the footage. He would stand in the grocer's back room and show the proofs. He would ask people, politely and firmly, to take responsibility. The neighborhood's ordinary rhythm had been disturbed. The darkness that had allowed small cruelties to pass unremarked must be lit. He felt in that decision an answer to a question he had not known he was asking: whether a man might still find himself useful. He lifted Mina into his arms, feeling the slight weight of her and the complicity of the life in his hands. The rosemary and ivy watched solemnly, the plants steady in their small ritual. He set the camera to record again, because if the world would not bear witness, he would make it bear witness. He placed the quilt at the foot of the lamp and sat with the cat as the night gathered. The phone's screen gleamed with the faint imprint of the half number he had called. He pressed his thumb to it as if to ground himself. Outside, the lamplight stirred and made long fingers of light across the pavement. Then, as if the night wished to deliver the next piece of its narrative in a single, awful beat. There came a sound not like a footfall but like an engine stalling, a bump in the street that sent a small flock of leaves skittering. The man turned toward the window, heart sudden in his throat, and the camera's red light blinked like a small, faithful eye. In the alley beyond the hedges, something moved that was not a fox and not a gust. A figure had appeared under the flyover, and for a reason he could not yet admit, the man felt the old balance tilt. The next minute would demand an answer, and he could not tell whether the answer would be for him or for Mina. He reached for the phone. He pressed the button to record. The figure under the flyover stepped into a shaft of light, and, in that brief clarity, the camera captured a face, not fully in resolution, but clear enough for the stomach to recognize intent. The man leaned forward as if pulled, and in the cage of his throat a sound rose that might have been a prayer. The light would show what the lens had kept secret for nights, and when the truth arrived it would not be small. It would insist on being seen. He had been led to this moment by the slow accumulation of small duties and by the sudden, fierce demand of a scrap of paper. There was no turning back. The community that had conferred with him, the vet who had bandaged the cat's wounds, the little green rosemary that had kept vigil, all waited on one side of the threshold. On the other stood a shadowed figure in a secret whose weight might topple more than one life. He pressed the camera's playback and watched the light flare. Then the screen went black for an instant, and in that blackness something moved toward the porch. The night air carried accusations, small sounds that do not connive, but declare. Under the flyover where the gutters gather old confessions, a camera had found a face. For nights the man had watched recorded light and stitched a case out of pixels. A cat dragging herself toward his doorstep lamp, a scrap of cloth with a courier's emblem, a hooded figure that kept its secrets. He had expected the truth to be a simple tally, cruelty perhaps, and then an apology. Instead, the truth came like a knot, layered, human, and bitter with fear. The people who might answer were the same people who stepped around trouble as if it were a puddle that might splash their shoes. The scrap on his porch had said, "We saw, do not tell." The phone had warned him to be quiet. The camera, however, had one unarguable thing, a face in a shaft of light. The man felt the house tilt under the weight of that exposure. Outside, the neighborhood's ordinary noises arranged themselves like an audience. Inside, the rosemary leaned as if to listen. There is a moment, thin as a filament, when a witness decides whether to speak. He was about to find whether courage moved in him, or whether the street would choose silence again. They met at dusk, not as soldiers, but as a small deputation of people who had decided that a thing ought not be tolerated. The grocer with flowery palms, Farah with blankets folded under her arm, the vet who smelled of antiseptic and that professional kindness which is both blunt and warm, the postal boy whose curiosity had become loyalty, and the man himself, with the camera wrapped in a towel like a sacred object. They gathered in the grocer's narrow back room where the light was low and opinions sat like bread. The screen, when it winked into life, threw their faces into the flicker of witness. The footage, each frame a slow, honest accusation, played and replayed. They watched Mina's thin body edge forward, watched the hooded figure move, watched the small hands that might have been childish reach and withdraw. The room breathed as if it were in a single lung, and each exhalation carried a growing gravity. When the clip reached the moment the figure stepped clear into light, all eyes leaned forward like flowers toward rain. The man paused the play with a hand that no longer trembled for fear, but because a decision had taken hold. The image showed a face partly shaded, a nose, a mouth, a jaw that set like a hinge. It was not the face of some distant ghost. It was the face of someone known, or rather, of someone related to the neighborhood's soft architecture. The vet uttered a single small word, Khalid. The syllable landed in the room like a stone. Khalid ran a courier depot. He was a man the neighborhood recognized as part of their daily machinery. Parcels collected, packages moved, jobs sometimes done by hands that changed with urgency. He was also a man who kept his head down and his accounts closer. The grocer spat softly into his palm. Khalid, but why? The postal boy could not look away. It is an old truth that familiarity can both ease and conceal offenses. A man who knows how to make himself useful can also make himself useful as a shield. The footage offered proximity, not motive. The question the man felt like a seed was now an urgent root, If Khalid appeared in the frame, was he an instigator, an observer, or something else entirely? They did not have time to theorize in comfort. They would go ask. Courage, the man thought, is often a neighborly thing. You assemble people like a cupboard, and together you hold light to a corner. They followed the path the camera had traced. Gutters that smelled of old rain, a lane where the bins lined up like sleepy sentries. The courier depot was a jumble of cages and tarpaulin, a place that smelled of diesel and tape. Inside it, men moved like small machines, lifting boxes and folding bills. The man's arrival, a cluster of tired, determined faces, made the depot look momentarily like a theater, where a small drama would be rehearsed in plain sight. Khalid was there, a man with a habit of checking his hands and a jaw that had worn decisions into it. When the grocer asked if they might speak, he looked puzzled, then guarded. People here have questions, the grocer said, eyes on Khalid. About a cat. Khalid's face did not shift into aggression at first. In the beginning, there was only a careful politeness, as if he were a man being offered kindly fruit. A cat? He repeated, as if the subject were trivial. We move parcels, brother. I don't have time for... The man held up the camera like an altar text. He did not shout. Shouting has a way of letting things dissolve into performances. He showed the footage. Khalid watched the frames with a face that thinned into something unreadable. For one breath, he looked like the man who had, for years, been part of the neighborhood's landscape. For the next breath, there was a small, hardening flicker that made the man's chest tighten. Why were you there that night? The man asked. We have a frame of your face. Khalid's answer came slow. I was delivering like always. People forget we work nights. The kid, Arif, he hangs around with the boys sometimes. They are foolish. I told him to go home. That's all? There are many ways to be culpable. There are the hands that strike and the hands that stand by. Khalid's reply had the easy cadence of someone offering only plausible innocence. The grocer's mouth made a sour line. The vet's eyes searched Khalid like a sighted animal looking for scent. The postal boy said, Then why does the scrap of cloth with your emblem appear in the footage? Why does your depot's mark show up on the cloth? Khalid's answer did not break toward confession. He shrugged as if the world's moral ledger were a neighbor's rummage sale. Clothes and rags travel, he said. Everyone borrows, everyone loses. I didn't... His voice stopped because in many neighborhoods the things that keep a man safe are not always honest. The vet, who had seen too many wounds, leaned forward. Did you see what they did? She asked. Did you ever stop them? Khalid looked down. A moment's hesitation split his features. Then he spoke, a small sound like a key turning. You can't blame a depot for the mischief of boys. The phrase carried a sting of self-justification that did not disguise fear. The grocer's knuckles whitened. Someone muttered that the man needed the law, and the vet said quietly that sometimes laws are slow and do not comfort thin chests. The postal boy's face had made coal of anger. He wanted immediacy. The man felt the warm pressure of a choice looming. Escalate now. Make a ruckus and call the police or try for another route. Before a plan could harden, the depot's gate slammed and a shadow moved at the lip of the light. A boy emerged, shoulders hunched, face young yet taut with the old habit of being defensive. It was Arif. He had been named before in whispers. Now he appeared, and being young made his guilt both smaller and more combustible. He looked at the cluster of neighbors and then down at his hands as if the hands would tell him what to do. You should not have shown the tape, he said at last. But it was not accusation. It was the plea of one who understands that exposure can be a punishable thing in the currency of fear. The grocer's voice rose like a bell. What did you do to that cat? Arif's reply came like a splinter. We were playing. We chased animals. We didn't mean to. He faltered, then continued. Khalid sometimes throws things out at the alley to see how the rats go. We followed. It wasn't supposed to be. He could not finish. There are limits to how far words can go when guilt is a current. The vet stepped in, her voice low and sharp. Did you hurt the cat? Arif shut his eyes, and the answer that left his mouth was a ragged apology. We kicked at it. We made it run. I hit it with a stick once. It didn't die till later. The man felt the world tilt. The admission settled like lead in the room. The faces around him contracted and then collected themselves. Nobody in the cluster moved to violence. Instead, a quieter reparation began to form in the marrow of their bones. Legal channels, community talks, making sure an animal did not rot on the street again. Khalid's jaw went rigid. For a moment he looked like a man who had been unmasked in a mirror. It was then that Arif's father arrived, drawn by the commotion, his stride like a judgment. He was not wholly of bad will. He was a man with the compound weight of debt and of a job that made him wear nights. But when he heard his son's confession, his face shut down into a hard old register. "You spoke?" he demanded. And there was the angry defensive quality of a man afraid of losing his son to the law's lecture. "People saw," the grocer said. "The footage is clear." Arif's father sprang into the code families know best. Protect the young, deny the harm, bargain for new behavior. The conversation turned into a negotiation of shame. The man watched the boy and the father and found his pity diluted by the sharp need for justice. He had a camera in the footage, but he was not naive. He knew the law could be slow, and he also knew the human heart could be messy and forgiving in dangerous ways. The vet suggested a plan: treat Mina further, push to have the boys attend community service, and bring the matter to the local magistrate if necessary. The grocer nodded. The postal boy swore softly, and they thought themselves a net of common sense. Then, as if the air itself decided to ratchet the stakes one notch, Khalid moved out from the depot and did something the man did not expect. He reached into the pocket at his waist and brought out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. He set it on a crate like an offering and unwrapped it with the gravity of a man about to confess. Inside it lay a folded scrap of fabric and a sprig of rosemary, the plant that had watched at the man's windowsill. The rosemary was not Martha's rosemary or just any tender. It had been clipped and bound with a string. Its scent opened like a small, undeniable truth. The man recognized the gesture, a deliberate act of memory. Khalid's face softened. He said, "I wasn't all at the scene. I saw it later. I gave boys work and they came here sometimes. The scrap might be mine, someone dropped it. But the rosemary, that's mine too." He looked at the rosemary with something like grief. "I found that sprig by a drain the other day," he admitted, "and I took it because someone had left it there like a sign. Maybe someone—" He stopped because the speech that follows remorse is usually rough. The rosemary's inclusion in the scene was a small, fierce payoff. It tied the man's domestic witness to the depot's public life. The plant that had watched had passed into the world as sign. Someone had put not just a word but a token into the night. The grocer asked who would leave such a thing. The postal boy guessed someone with guilt. Khalid said, "There are people who work the night shifts who see things and are scared. We are not saints." He sounded almost like a plea not to be judged as the sum of a single frame. Before the group could agree on a path forward, another sound intervened, a vehicle, abrupt and brash, unloaded at the depot and left idling like a dog. From its shadow a man emerged who was not known to them. He carried the kind of authority that wears no badge but commands the small economies of fear. He was broader than Khalid, older than the father, and his eyes had the quality of a man who had been given good reasons to believe the world owed him obedience. He moved to the group like someone closing a book. "You lot making trouble?" he asked in the voice of a man who assumed the ground of things. The man felt a new tension braid itself through the air. The newcomer's presence shifted the geometry. People straightened. The vet tucked her head like a bird thinking of flight. The grocer's respect turned to cautiousness. This was the kind of man who compels silence without asking. He looked like someone who had been consulted and needed no argument. The newcomer's name, when someone whispered it, landed like ice: Javed. His reputation had been an open secret, an enforcer for small-time rivals, someone who liked power not because it bought him respect, but because it kept others from asking too many questions. He looked at Khalid with a calculating stillness that turned place into a ledger. "You lot stirring up trouble for my friend?" he said at last. His hand rested on a pocket as if it could draw forth anything needed to make things stop. The man's courage, which had felt like a small warm ember, now confronted a wind. He had a camera and the law and a cluster of witnesses, but he had no official badge and little appetite for dangerous heroics. He thought of Mina's battered ribs and the little beat of breath underneath his palm earlier that day. He thought of the vet's hand steady, and one of their neighbors' faces when they had seen the footage. He thought, too, of the scrap left on his door that had warned and taunted him. "We saw. Do not tell." He realized the quiet of this neighborhood had been bought by a tacit fear. Javed's smile was not warm. He said, "We do not like people poking their nose. Bring it to the magistrate if you must, but not in my yard." The words were a closed fist disguised as civility. The man felt the temperature of the room drop. The notion of going to the police, once the obvious route, dissolved in the face of Javed's look. Javed did not need to say more to make the meaning plain. Push this and you could unsettle things that would not settle politely. Arif's father, his jaw clenched, put a hand on his son's shoulder and said, "With that weary combination of plea and protection, we will sort this quietly." The father's eyes were the eyes of a man who knows the world will break him if he allows it to crack too wide. The grocer, who had been angry but practical, muttered agreement. For a long stretch, it looked as if the momentum toward public justice might be stalled by the neighborhood's own omerta. The man felt the public and private lines that most people draw in times of trouble fold up like maps. It was then the man did what he had rehearsed inwardly for nights. He pressed the camera to record despite the pressure to hush. His fingers were steady. He asked the vet to narrate briefly what she had witnessed clinically. He asked the grocer to outline what they had pooled for Mina's care. He told the postal boy to keep the footage safe. He placed the camera in the depot's center and asked the men there to listen. He said, steady as a bell, "This is not simply about one cat. This is about what we let happen in the alley when we look the other way. It's about whether our children grow up thinking cruelty is sport because the adults will not speak." Javed laughed, not loudly, but as one might laugh at the weather's misjudgment. "You want to play moralist?" he said. "You want to tell me how to run my affairs? You are a soft old man who records shadows. Go home and bake bread." The insult carried the spun cruelty of a man who prefers to reduce others to caricature, to avoid the actual need of answering for things. The man felt his old grief, in which had long been a soft shadow in his chest, quicken into a fire. He did not know why exactly he had been chosen to hold this moment, but perhaps choices do not always wait to be earned. Sometimes they arrive and ask whether you will take them. He stepped forward. "If we do not hold our children to better example," he said, "they will be the ones who make a city cruel. If we let fear be the reason we say nothing, then we are complicit." For once, his words were not only rhetoric, they had a practical edge. People around him felt it. The vet, moved by a courage compounded by medicine's plainness, spoke up. "I will testify regarding the cat's injuries. The footage will be evidence. We will go to the magistrate." The grocer, steadied by the man's tone, added, "I will sign a statement." The postal boy said he would bring the footage to any official who had the sense to listen. Allies coalesced like something that once small can become a rope. Javed's face, which had been composed of small certainties, cracked in a moment of calculation. He had power because everyone had feared him, but he had no appetite for the attention of law. He weighed the small set of consequences and made a choice that shivered. "If this goes to the magistrate," he said, "it will be trouble for everyone. I will not be part of a crowd turning on my friends." He offered an alternative that smelled of menace disguised as compromise. "Leave this alone," he said. "We will pay the vet for the cat. The boys will be told. No more." The man looked at Arif. His face had drained of color. He looked at the father, whose eyes had the weary softness of someone who would do anything to keep the boy from a worse fate. He looked at the vet, whose hands hovered like scales. The options were raw and plain. Accept a hush that might protect the boys and spare families, or force a public accounting that could escalate unpredictably. He felt the moral weight like timber on his chest. He knew somewhere in the quiet that justice is not always served by exposure, but exposure is necessary for some reckonings. Then, like a bird falling to a window, the night gave its most grievous sound, a shout that came from the depot's darker corner where crates made shadow play. Someone had found the scrap of paper the man had folded and stashed in his coat pocket. The one that had said, "We saw. Do not tell." It lay on the ground, a small treachery. A voice accused the man of betrayal. The scrap had been found by someone who felt betrayed by being spoken of. The depot's men circled like wary animals. Khalid's knuckles whitened around a crate. Javed's hand dipped toward a belt. For a sliver of breath, the man thought, perhaps speaking had been naive. Perhaps the street silences are hard to break. In the scuffle that followed, hands grabbed at the camera and the towel slipped. The camera, which had been the man's witness, clattered and slid on the gravel toward a drain. For the man, time threw itself into a thinness, a sound of plastic on stone, the scent of gasoline, the scrape of leather. He lunged. Mina, whose name hung in the man's mouth like a small prayer, had been brought into the depot's shadow by a neighbor's efforts to keep her warm. In the confusion, she panicked, tearing free and disappearing into the night's nearest knot of refuse. The moment held like a breath caught between two ages. Some things are taken by reckless hands, some by accident, some by the slow cruelty of indifference. The camera fell. Its lens scraped a rock and its red light blinked out as if starved of witness. Javid laughed, a short, ugly sound, and scooped up the fallen footage. The man watched his instrument of truth vanish into a hand that trained the neighborhood in the economy of fear. He felt his courage narrow into something like a strand and then coil. Then, and this is the suddenness with which life insists, a thin voice from across the depot called out, and it was the postal boy. "Stop," he said, simple and small but like a line drawn in chalk. "This is not how we handle things." The words made a few faces lift. For a moment the depot smelled like an animal baying and a human heart doing something brave, but the danger had not left. Javid's patience was unraveling, and with it the neighborhood's tentative coalition. As hands closed and words rose, something else occurred that the man had not expected. A movement at the depot's edge where crates made a low labyrinth. A screech, a shuffle, and Mina darted out, a shadow of suffering and speed. She ran not toward the lamplight but toward the deeper street, toward some alley that knew her frightened footfalls. The man felt the hot arrow of panic. He lunged after her, but a body barred him. A crate smashed against his shin and he stumbled. The camera that the fragile, honest witness had been seized. Javid held it like evidence and like a weapon. He looked at the man, and for an unfriendly second there was a clarity. If he wanted the camera, he wanted to bury the possibility of public light. The man felt fear scrape his throat. He also felt something else. A stubbornness like an old root that will not be felled. He had choices, and the night offered none gently. He could chase the cat through the alleyways in the dark and risk more. Risk injury, more fury, the small precariousness of acting alone. Or he could step back, gather what witnesses he could, and call for legal aid, trusting it might move their slow gears in time. In the center of him, between the ache for Mina and the risk of blowback, a small voice asked what kind of man he would choose to be. The neighborhood's quiet, he realized, had been a complicit thing. Its breaking would not be pretty, but silence could not be the man's final offering to Mina. As he tensed to move, to run, to fight, or to summon law, Javid's hand tightened on the camera, and a small metallic glint caught the light. A badge? A tool? Javid's eyes were a plate of dark promise. He raised his head, and for reasons that no one there could claim to forecast fully, he shouted in a voice that made the grocer flinch, "Take your choice, then. Run after the cat, or stand here and learn to live with what you did." His words were a trap disguised as an ultimatum. The man felt the moment crystallize into two possible endings. He had never been a man to court danger, yet Mina's breath had been steadied in his hands not long ago. Her thin life had been entrusted to his care. He saw the rosemary in his mind's eye, its leaves like a congregation, and the ivy that had threaded its way along his windowsill. The plants had borne witness to small mercies and to small betrayals. If he learned anything from them, it was that life keeps a ledger and that small acts tally up into the kind of person one becomes. He took one step, and then another. He ignored the crate that threatened his shin. He moved with the steadiness of someone who had no choice but to follow what his heart had already decided. The postal boy, seeing the man move, chose his side. Others muttered and then moved. For an instant there was a cluster of allies. Mina, a small dark slip between alleys, darted like an answer between their feet. Then the world did what stories sometimes do. It turned its face and hid something in the tooth of chance. A truck backing up around the corner startled a dog which barked. A voice yelled, and in the confusion someone struck a match to light a cigarette, and the flare caught against the camera's casing. The man's foot caught an upturned iron and he fell. A cry rose. Mina slipped beneath the wheel arch of a parked van. The red light blinked on the camera once more, and then, as if the night were exhausted of its miracles, everything went black. Would you stay, if you were in their place? When the night had closed and the camera's red pulse had died, the neighborhood felt as if someone had pulled a blanket over its face. The man lay for a long time on the cold step. The gravel's bite pressed into the palms of his hands, and the world around him hummed like an instrument that had been struck and not yet tuned. Mina's absence made an absence inside the house that was physical and particular. The quilt that had once held her warmth cooled to the temperature of memory. The saucer of milk congealed into a dull suggestion of what had been. The rosemary on the sill, which had borne witness to the first inching of the creature toward the lamplight, seemed to droop as if the plant had inhaled sorrow and could not exhale it. The man felt that sorrow like a limb he must learn to move again. There was no single answer to the way communities stitch themselves after a scrape. Some threads fray, some mend, some are tied into knots that must be cut loose. The man, who had once kept his ledger of grief close to his chest, now found himself making lists of errands and faces and obligations. He could feel in the first raw hour after the depot's confrontation that he had summoned about him a weather. People reached and retreated and then reached again like tides. The vet went to check on Mina's last known tracks with a lantern and a memory. The postal boy ran home to see if he had saved any duplicate files from the camera. Farah fetched a blanket and a pot of sage tea as if tea could brew patience. The grocer pulled strings with an old friend at the magistrate's office. The man moved in this small migration like someone who had discovered they had a new job, the job of keeping a promise. The first concrete relief arrived because of something the man had done almost without thinking. Before he left for the depot, he had asked the postal boy to copy the footage to a small memory card while he went to fetch neighbors. The postal boy had done it and then, in the clumsy haste of his making do, had slipped the card into his pocket rather than into the camera's slot. It was the kind of small prosaic mistake that is also a blessing. The footage that had been seized and was now held by Javed in a depot's dim corner had been duplicated. The postal boy produced the card with a face that made him look both guilty and heroic. On it were the frames that mattered: the cat's approach, the hooded figure, the shard of cloth, the face under the light. The images were not cinematic in the way a film might be. They were humble blocks of truth. But truth, even in a raw and pixelated form, is a kind of tool. The vet solemnly tucked the card into her jacket like a talisman and said she would make certain there were copies for the magistrate. This small recovery changed the gravity of the situation. What had been a fragile assembly of witnesses turned into something more solid. Evidence that could be taken, shown, and sworn to. The man felt hope return in a thin line, for hope in the world of facts is often a matter of having the right document. Yet even with the card in hand, there remained the immediate task of finding Mina. They combed the alleys in teams, calling her name as if a chorus could conjure a lost thing. The man learned the topography of the neighborhood anew, where rats nested, where old men smoked and told stories, where children hid skimming stones. The rosemary scent followed them like a prayer in the air, for the man had tied a sprig to his lapel, the plant an unspoken vow. Mina's tracks were a thin testimony. Paw prints on a ribbon of damp soil, a tuft of fur snagged on a nail. The vet and the man followed them until they met a moment of silence under a low bridge, where the heat of the day had been stored in the stones. It was there a child's laughter had once echoed, and now in the dark, the sound of scurrying rats filled the space. Mina had found a refuge there. Animals often do where human light does not reach. They moved slowly and spoke little, because in grief the world's small edges are best approached with quiet feet. When they found Mina, she was shivering under a crate, the light from a distant shop cutting the silhouette of her like a small confession. Her ribs stood sharp. Her breathing was a rhythm the vet measured with the clinical patience of someone who has seen such things most of her life. The man felt a surge of something that was not merely relief but a complicated gratitude, that he had been granted the chance to repair, and also a weary anger that what had happened to Mina had been possible in the first place. He wrapped her in the blanket Farah had brought and carried her like a secret that must be kept sacred. The rosemary sprig at his lapel brushed his chin and reminded him of the small green witness back at the house. In that touch he felt a completion of the day's small contracts. Watch, search, bring back. Mina's recovery was neither swift nor sterile. It was an argument the body and the community had with hurt. The vet opened her clinic in odd hours and administered treatments. The man learned to hold syringes with the clumsy tenderness of a novice. Farah cooked soft soups the cat would not always touch, but sometimes did. The grocer left jars of boiled chicken, and the neighbor who liked to keep pigeons offered a soft wing. Each act was a soft stitch. Arif and his father, whose confession had been a bitter thing, offered labor in small reparation. They scrubbed yards, moved crates, painted fences. Sometimes their apologies were more than words. Sometimes they were clumsy acts of service that the man accepted with a complicated heart. There is no neat ledger for contrition. It arrives in uneven installments. Community engagement, which had been a hesitant thing, took on a new shape. The vet, having the duplicated footage and the clinical notes, made an appointment with the magistrate. The grocer drafted a statement signed by several neighbors. Khalid, whose involvement had been ambiguous and whose rosemary gesture had been as much an admission as a token, offered to testify to the depot's patterns and to hand over employment logs showing the boys who worked the night runs. His voice when he spoke at the hearing carried a quiet that stunned the man. Sometimes courage is not a roar but a slow, steady pledge. He said that he had seen mischief there but had been afraid to tell the truth, fearful of losing income, fearful of retribution. The man realized then that fear is a many-windowed thing. It both shelters and imprisons, and to step out of it sometimes requires the kindness of the frightened to each other. Arif's father, who had at first wrapped his son in denial, met with the grocer and the vet in a public room and agreed to their terms. Arif would attend counseling and restitution, and the family would take smaller steps to teach care rather than contempt. It is the strange mercy of small communities that wrongdoing sometimes leads to reclamation. The man who had begun this by counting breaths and measuring milk found himself in the odd position of being a gentle ambassador for a future he had not sought, one where boys might be taught to be less cruel. The moral of a story, as Kipling might note in a whisper, is not only the punishment of the wicked but the instruction of the ignorant. The magistrate, a woman whose face had the firmness of one who deals in human follies and forgives them with rules, listened with a patience that was not the same as indifference. The evidence was presented. The vet's notes, the duplicated footage, the grocer's statement, a handful of signed neighbor accounts. The scrap that had said "we saw, do not tell" was also produced. When Khalid explained his rosemary gesture and the way the scrap had been left, the magistrate leaned as if to catch a detail. Javed, who had made the depot a place where silence was currency, was called in and asked directly about the camera. He squirmed and then said he had taken it only to examine the footage to judge whether this was something that could be kept quiet. He had not intended to destroy anything, he claimed. The man, who had felt Javed's hand like a closing door, watched the man's demeanor shift under the weight of public attention. For all Javed's threats, the law's light had a steadiness that charmed public fear away. The magistrate ordered restitution. The depot would pay part of Mina's veterinary bills. Arif and his father would perform community service and participate in animal care education. Javed would be fined for interference with potential evidence and admonished publicly for intimidation. The city arranged for a small campaign, run through the grocer's support and the vet's influence, about kindness to stray animals and the responsibility of care. It was not the thunder of profound justice, but justice sometimes arrives as a long tide rather than a lightning bolt. The man found himself participating in a meeting where local officials promised more regular patrols and the installation of better lighting in the lanes where children tended to play at night. These were small municipal stitches, but stitches nevertheless. Through these acts, the man changed. He had come into the story as someone who measured life by the polite increments of solitude. He left it with a new capacity for connection. Where once he had measured his days in teaspoons and cups, he now measured them in the rise and fall of a cat's breath and in the faces of neighbors who had stepped forward. He began to leave the window open more often, not because he expected drama, but because he had reclaimed the practice of watching in a way that meant something other than loneliness. He started quietly and with the ease of habit forming to coordinate the little network that had rescued Mina. A rota for visits to the vet, a list of names for emergency calls, and a shelf in his kitchen where a jar of coins was kept for such crises. The house, which had kept him to itself, opened to the slow traffic of small duties. The rosemary, which had been a proof of persistence, thrived on the sill, its leaves plumped by water and small conversation. It was a poetic payoff. The plant that had once foreshadowed renewal now participated in it, its scent a recurring benediction. Mina, over the coming weeks, grew in terms that were both literal and moral. She ate when coaxed, The vet taught the man how to administer medication gently. She began to purr in a way that made the man's chest feel less like a room, and more like a place in which something alive took up space. She would climb onto his lap at odd hours and look at him with the steady, inscrutable gaze of the feline that has weighed its debts and found them paid. Once, in a flourish that felt like an answer, she walked to the sill and pressed her head against the rosemary, as if to recognize the plant for the witness it had been. The man watched and understood that the plant's presence had been a small promise kept. The cameras that had once held the scene were not wholly restored. The depot's men had dented its casing and Javd had threatened its small life. Yet the postal boy's duplicate footage had been kept safe in multiple copies, distributed to the magistrate, to the vet, and to the grocer. It is a small lesson that truth, when shared, resists erasure. The camera itself, patched and cleaned by Khalid at cost, was returned to the man with an apology that was half shame and half an offer of amends. Khalid left another sprig of rosemary on the porch that day, not as a token of guilt, but as a token of agreement. A green compact that said, "We will witness together." Not everything returned to the man's prior form. There were days when the memory of Mina's thin approach, of her slow hauling toward the porch light, would rise like tide and wash over him. There were nights when he would wake and find himself watching the doorway for shapes that might be going to harm. Yet these nights carried a different quality. Not the hollow of loneliness, but the watchful attentiveness of care. He found that his grief had become a shape in which other things could sit, and that was a mercy he had not expected. It would have been dishonest to say that the neighborhood became an Eden. People still had struggles. Economies were still tight and tempers would sometimes flare, but the event had altered the neighborhood's grammar. The lines about who could be asked for help had shifted. The habit of looking away had thinned. Children were taught in the small public school a short lesson about gentleness to animals. The grocer sponsored a small mural where Mina's silhouette was painted beside rosemary leaves as a quiet reminder of the night the community learned to care. Arif, under the guidance of counseling and the stern mercy of making amends, began to visit the vet's clinic and learn the basics of tending the weak. He would not be redeemed in a day. None of them would be. But there was movement toward something better. In the quiet hours when the man sat with Mina curled like a small moon on his lap, he remembered the scrap of paper on his porch, the tense note that had warned him to be silent. He thought of the voice that had called, the thin menace of anonymous watchers, and felt a small sorrow for the ideas that breed in shadows. But he also recognized that the scrap's threat had been a kind of challenge. It had proved that silence can be weaponized, but that silence can also be undermined by courage small and persistent enough to gather neighbors and assemble facts. The little man who had once lived among his teacups discovered in himself a capacity to keep watch and to act. Here is the quiet question, asked in ways that do not dissolve into sentiment. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The man would sometimes ask that aloud at the grocer's counter or over tea with Farah, and the answers came back like small confessions. A dog who had waited on a stoop, a parrot that had taught its owner to talk again, a turtle that had survived despite a child's thoughtlessness. These stories made up a patchwork in which Mina's thread was not the only one, but was bright enough to be noticed. The falling action of their lives was not a tidy string, but a series of small agreements and adjustments. The vet's clinic submitted its copy of the footage to local animal welfare authorities, who tracked down more evidence and issued warnings. The magistrate's rubrics and the depot's new rules made it less easy for cruelty to pass unnoticed. The postal boy's modest courage became a lesson whispered to other youths who worked odd hours. Save a copy, keep a witness. The grocer and Khalid reconciled through the awkward commerce of shared responsibility. And the man, who had once used a camera to collect light for himself, now used it to teach prescription and care. He learned that witness could be a public good. Most of all, the rosemary, which had been an early plant of foreshadowing, grew into its role as a small altar of gratitude. The man planted a cutting in the garden below his window and tended it daily. Mina would sometimes rub herself against it and then leap into the lap of the man who had once been content with sorrow. The plant's leaves offered their scent when the house's windows were open, and the aroma threaded through the days like a remembered hello. It was a small literal payoff for a plant that had once symbolized continuity, a plant that had kept a secret, then helped to tell it. The falling action closed with a series of small, honest tasks, healing, apology, reparation, strengthening of communal bonds. It left the man changed in ways that were modest and true. He no longer needed to measure his days in teaspoons. He had learned to count the breaths of another being and to let that accounting reshape the meaning of his life. The house that had remembered him by habit now had a habit of remembering others as well. Neighbors, animals, truths. In that change there was a moral of the sort Kipling might have admired. That the smallest creatures can insist upon responsibility, and that human conscience can be sharpened by soft encounters. When the days smoothed and the business of life settled into its new rut, the man would sometimes sit and watch the lamplight on the step. He would recall the scrape of a paw across stone, the camera's red light blinking out, the scrap of paper that had told him to keep quiet. He would touch the rosemary's leaves and find in them the scent of small miracles. He understood at last that rescue is rarely the product of one man's nobility. It is the aggregate of small acts by ordinary people who decide to do the right thing, even when it is inconvenient. He had been given a place in that assembly, and he kept it with gentle pride. The stage was set now for one last act of closure, when the story would return its final gift. But even as the falling action receded into the background of daily life, its lessons had lodged in the man's ribs. Witness matters. Plants keep their promises. A camera can make a dark corner into a public room, and a small life can rearrange the gravity of a heart. The neighborhood had learned awkwardly and imperfectly to be accountable. And the man, who had once thought himself useful only to his own solitude, found he had more to offer. A watchful presence, a cultivated courage, and a home where, by the light of the doorstep, a cat could come and be kept. The last light of summer held its breath on the windowsill, and in that hush the house learned to expect small miracles. The cat that had come like a slow apology had become less a visitor and more a currency of quiet. A purr, a weight in the lap, a demand upon gentleness. The man who had measured his days by empty teacups now marked them by the cadence of Mina's breath and the lean press of her head against his palm. Neighbors passed the door with softened faces. The grocer's routine included the small bag of boiled chicken. Even the depot's men began to speak in a tone that admitted fault had been noticed. Yet stories do not end merely because wounds heal. Endings must be earned with a small finalness and a gift, a reckoning, a seal. In the dark between one life and the next, Mina would offer a token that was neither spectacle nor triumph, but the kind of simple, unavoidable mercy that changes how one measures the world. The house, the rosemary, the camera, the man, each held their breath for the moment when living at last made itself whole again. When the days cooled and the magistrate's papers were signed, the ordinary sounds of the lane returned as if learning a new rhythm. The depot's wakefulness steadied under rules that had once seemed like an invention for other people. Javed kept a distance that was neither menace nor friendship, a cautious truce that looked like the compromise of those who had found themselves seen. Arif's father kept his promise to the community. Arif himself learned, slowly and by small humiliations of duty, how to scrub the gutters and water plants. Khalid, with his rosemary gesture now twice returned, made the depot a place where a record was kept and where young hands were supervised. The man's camera, patched and returned with a contrite hand, sat once more on the sill as if it had been bidden to stay. The small redundancies the postal boy had made, 2 memory cards tucked into pockets for safety, proved a custom, to be kept, and the vet continued to write notes that the magistrate read as if hearing the truth again. The household acquired a new pace. Mina's recovery had been an argument between the body's tired resilience and the labors of care. The stitches of medicine had been bound by hands that had learned to move kindly. The man learned to hold a syringe and to measure doses. His hands, once only adept at turning pages and pouring tea, learned the precision of giving. There were mornings when Mina's purr would rise into the house like a small sky. There were evenings when she would pad to the window and watch the street as if guarding it. The rosemary thrived, not only because it had been watered, but because it was watered with purpose now. The man tended it as an act of gratitude and as the memory it had always been, a living talisman that had coaxed a story into being. People changed in small increments. The depot instituted a rota so that no boy worked late without supervision. Local parents were invited to a modest workshop at the grocer's, where the vet explained the difference between play and cruelty. and why a bent stick and a frightened animal are never an acceptable lesson. The grocer mounted the small mural that showed Mina's silhouette beside rosemary leaves. An image that might have been ornamental became a covenant. Children who used to fling stones at drains were taught instead to look for nests and to keep account of how many lives seemed to need help. The magistrate's measure, fines, admonitions, restitution, had been more than law. It had been a social education, a signal that neighbors are not only the sum of their conveniences, but the guardians of a small shared ethic. Through all of this, the man changed most inwardly. The sorrow that had hollowed him was not abolished. Grief, the way the wise know, is not a problem to be solved, but a companion to be taught better manners. It no longer arranged his house-like furniture into a museum of absence. Instead, grief sat alongside compassion like a worn shawl he put on at need. He began to answer the door more often. People came in not as intrusions but as partners in the care Mina required. He learned how to be both precise and forgiving, to track a cat's medicine schedule and to forgive a neighbor for a remark said rashly. His life widened to hold other lives' accidents and their small recoveries. He had, in the end, become what the house had once been for him, a place that keeps vigil. If a story demands a final gift, Mina had chosen hers with a cat's particular wisdom. On a morning fragrant with rain and with the rosemary's sharp living scent, she rose earlier than usual and padded across the cool wooden floor. The man, half awake, watched as she went to the sill and then down to the window seat where his shoes lay. She pawed at one shoe, the one he had worn the night he chased the depot's shadow, and then did something small and impossible to schedule. She fished from within the shoe a tiny object wrapped in the cloth of the scrap that had once belonged to the depot. In her mouth she held not a mouse or a prize of violence, but a small, damp sprig of rosemary, knobbled and bent with one leaf slightly torn. The man blinked, and the kettle hissed as if to applaud. There was an absurd stir of laughter amid the tears. The sprig was not a thing of great value. It was a token the street had yielded, a green and humble witness returned to whose hands it had belonged. Mina placed it on the man's knee with the solemnity of a judge returning a verdict. She then flopped upon the quilt and gave a long, satisfied lick to her paw. The gesture was a benediction. It had a clarity that literature sometimes cannot contain. The cat, who had crawled toward a light out of need and trust, had carried back for him the plant that had been his first proof that life might persist. It was both a thank you and a sharing of a burden. In that small act lay the moral compact of the story. Care returns to us, not in grand coins, but in soft, green leaves. He pressed the rosemary to his lips and smelled the rain and the street and the quiet. He understood then the arc of what had been done. He had given shelter, the neighborhood had in time offered accountability, the law had performed its slow but necessary ritual, and Mina had given back a symbol. The threads that had once felt frayed were woven now into a modest cloth. There was a carryover. Khalid brought the man a small envelope months later with a handwritten note inside, an apology and a promise to look after the depot's youths. Arif came by to hand over a tray of painted stones done at the community workshop, each one with a small rosemary leaf painted under clear varnish. The postal boy got a modest raise after the neighbor's petition, and he bought a small, robust camera on which to copy evidence when the neighborhood needed a witness. But there were also quiet permanences. Mina's purr had become a thing. The man could measure by its own compass, and sometimes he would sit and time it the way he had once timed grief. 5 slow rising beats, a pause, and then another. The cadence steadied him. He took to leaving his window ajar at dusk, not because he awaited a spectacle, but because he had relearned the value of being available. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum, but like a room where life arrived and was tended. The rosemary's leaves brushed the glass and sent their scent in like an old patient letter. It was small consolation, but the kind that endures. There is, in stories that wish to be wise, a moment when the teller reaches for a truth and places it lightly but insistently before the reader. The universal truth the man discovered, not new but newly recognized O'Brien, was this: tenderness is an activity, not a trait. It is done. To feed, to bandage, to to stand in a room with the camera turned on and the knowledge that there will be consequences does not require heroic so much as consistent dull courage. Small acts compound into character. A street that once tolerated cruelty becomes, by the accumulation of enough small kindnesses, a street that tolerates the opposite. The moral, whispered rather than declaimed, is that a life is saved as much by the patient ordering of daily small duties as it is by thunderous gestures. Mina's survival had been less about the law's gavel than about a dozen small hands learning how to be accountable. The man would someday write, on a small card he kept beneath the rosemary pot, the list of what had been necessary. A memory card hidden in a pocket, a vet's readiness to testify, a grocer's willingness to sign, a postal boy's reflex to copy, a neighbor's casserole, and a kettle that would not stop boiling. It read to him like a recipe. One small witness, two people willing to be inconvenienced, the courage to name, a legal hand when necessary, water each morning. This kitchen note curriculum, absurd in its domesticity, became his creed. It was practical and brief and could be taught easily to a child. The eccentricity of a man who kept lists of kindness fit him like a new coat. And the community, having passed through a small theater of conscience, kept its lessons. The mural remained a quiet admonition painted in gentle blues and rosemary green. Children passed by and, pointing at Mina's painted silhouette, would be told the story in abridged form. A cat, a camera, neighbors who would not look away. They learned the verb of tendering. They learned that to look away is to allow injury, and that sometimes looking means inconvenient argument and uncomfortable law. Those were not glamorous lessons, but they were durable. In the months that followed, other small measures rippled outward. An elderly woman 3 streets over who had thought herself too frail to care began to take in a stray pigeon, coaxing it with seeds and then letting it go each evening, a small ritual that read like penance and like joy. A teenager learned to carry a water bottle for stray dogs in summer, and once he was embarrassed, then proud. A teacher in the local school included a passage about stewardship in her class. The ripple was not dramatic. It was the quiet, faithful kind that causes change by repetition. As for Mina, she lived as cats do, in sovereign smallness and in generous economy of affection. She would sometimes choose to sleep in the man's shoes, or in the crumpled paper bag that the grocer had given her on holidays, or at midday on the patch of sunlight that crossed the rug. She would prowl at night and return every so often with a small offering, a loosened ribbon, a feather, a leaf. Once, after a rain, she brought in a snail and left it upon the sill as if to say the world was large and strange, and offered sometimes gifts we did not ask for. The man accepted each offering as if it were a letter from life itself. He chewed the rosemary on his tongue like medicine, and learned to use his voice to ask for help when help was necessary. The camera continued to witness, but it was no longer his entire life. It was one tool among many. He sat at his table and wrote in his ledger and on his mind, things worth doing. The ending the man had imagined once, the simple comfort of a life that fit neatly into daily rituals, had been altered. It had been made wider, more accountable, and more present. This was not the kind of happy ending that annuls sorrow. Mina's survival was not a cancellation of past injuries. Instead, it was a transformation. The wound stayed as evidence of having loved poorly and of having acted late. The repair became testimony to what people become when they choose to stop looking away. The man's house, now fuller, held the traces of everyone who had lifted a broom or a kettle or a hand and became part of the story. The rosemary's leaves shone as if proud, and the little mural on the grocer's wall served as a map for future cares. One evening, months after the magistrate's decree, the man sat by the doorway under the same porch lamp that had first drawn Mina. He held the camera for a while, feeling its warm belly against his knee, then set it down and looked at the cat who had once been a figure of stooped endurance. Mina hopped up and pressed her head against his palm, as if to seal the compact they had shared. He felt the small solidness of life in that moment, ordinary, stubborn, enough. The neighborhood hummed its own private music beyond the window. A child laughing, a bicycle bell, the grocer sweeping, and he inhaled the rosemary's sharp kindness and let his breath fall into the music. Kipling's fables teach that actions have consequences and that animals are teachers as often as companions. In that spirit, the man learned a quiet law. that kindness teaches by being practiced, not by being preached. That witness is the first step toward repair, that small communities can hold large moral tasks if they allow themselves to be inconvenienced by compassion. Mina had been a pupil and a teacher at once. In her small, patient demands, she had taught the man and his neighbors how to be human with one another. And so the story ends not in fireworks, but in a soft illumination. The things left undone remain a ledger in the mind, a long list of streets to watch and stray lives to tend. But the man's ledger had been revised. It now included not only loss but acts of repair. He had become, in his own way, a custodian of rosemary, of a camera, of a neighbor's pledge, of a small cat that had crawled to a doorstep light, and in doing so had invited an entire street to stand up. The moral did not require a trumpet to be clear. The smallest life can rearrange the gravity of a city block if people will let it. In the end, Mina's final gift, the rosemary sprig placed like a benediction on his knee, became the story's seal. The sprig signified that the house kept what it had promised, that witness matters, that a camera, when held with honest hands, can make the invisible visible, that a neighborhood, when it chooses to see, can mend its faults, and that tenderness quietly practiced rewrites destinies. The man would, in time, tell the story in fragments to those who asked: the child at the grocer's, the new neighbor who would peep in, the boy who had once thrown stones. He told it not as a boast but as instruction, how a small life had made them better by insisting on being kept. The light on the doorstep burned steady that night as a domestic sun. Mina curled around his feet, and the man, with rosemary pressed under his thumb in a private habit, listened to the street, content as one may be who has been made whole not by erasing sorrow but by learning how to care. The house hummed gently. The camera rested like a companion, and the plants kept their green counsel. The moral of the tale, practical and not lofty, settled into him like an old coat. Be watchful, be brave in small ways, keep the witnesses safe, and let tenderness be done. The world thus tended might yet be kinder. You stayed with me till the very end, thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.